I am legally distinct Blandrew Bryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the parasite, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the White House, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not be regulated, where the surgeon would not be bound by petty morality, where the great man would not be taxed by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well. Bioshock, the spiritual successor to System Shock that came out before they put politics in my damn video games. I grew up with this being my favorite game, only later usurped by Outer Wilds, but I never really thought too deeply about it. I knew that there were some whiffs of ideology and it was making some kind of statement, but for me that largely boiled down to, I guess a man does choose and a slave obeys. I decided that I should maybe take a deeper look into the game and see what all this Andrew Ryan stuff was all about. And, this video will be focusing solely on Bioshock 1, and if you know anything about its politics, then you know that Andrew Ryan is a not-so-subtle nod to Ayn Rand. And if you know anything about Ayn Rand, then I'm sorry. Ayn Rand is the 20th century philosopher responsible for the book Atlas Shrugged, and for most people that's as far as their knowledge goes. Atlas Shrugged is a monster of a book, clocking in at 1,069 pages. So very few people actually bother to read the damn thing nowadays. It was a huge deal back in 1957 when the book first released, but after 70 years, the number of readers and the cultural significance of the book have largely waned. The work of Ayn Rand, however, has held a pretty strong influence on American, and by extension global politics, despite the years and the negative press. People in positions of power seem to love her work. Donald Trump said that The Fountainhead, the book she wrote before Atlas Shrugged, was his favorite book. Till he changed his mind to the Bible, I guess. So with that being said, the critiques in Bioshock should still be prescient, right? Well, to find out, I actually read the damn thing. All 1,069 pages. I even read The Fountainhead for good measure, which was another 752 pages. Thankfully, audiobooks exist, but altogether that was a combined 92 hours of audiobook. Sorry, 95 hours. That's over a month of full-time work, and I am not putting it to waste. And what are the critiques that Bioshock puts forward? Well, to answer that, we'll have to lay some groundwork first. So to start, who is Ayn Rand? My goal here is not to lay out a comprehensive history of Ayn Rand and her work, but instead to provide just enough so you understand her headspace and her rise to prominence. A lot of her early life is actually really annoying to research because there doesn't seem to be a lot of resources outside of Wikipedia and more books that are 500 pages long. The most comprehensive source online seems to be AynRand.com, the official website of the Ayn Rand Institute. And if the name didn't clue you in, they're not the most reliable resource. They aggressively narrativize her history, launder her image, and try to push her ideas while carefully dancing around the embarrassing parts. So I will try my best to present a neutral timeline. Pardon me for this part of my script if I'm looking at my computer a lot. This part has a lot of numbers. Alyssa Rosenbaum was born in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1905. Born to an upper-middle-class family in the heart of Russia, they were heavily affected by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. They fled to Crimea to escape the fighting. That, combined with the communists winning in 1923 and then subsequently nationalizing her father's pharmacy business, led to periods of severe financial hardship. They returned to St. Petersburg in 1924, where Alyssa went to the University of Petrograd to study filmmaking. 2 years later, her mother had set up an arrangement for Alyssa to meet relatives that were in Chicago, and Alyssa used this as an opportunity to escape Russia permanently, telling authorities that she was going to America to learn filmmaking to rebuild the Soviet film industry. She arrived in America, hopped on a train to Hollywood to chase her dreams of being a filmmaker, and changed her name to Ayn Rand. It was around this time that America would culturally shift to being as anti Russian as hard as they can. America wanted to be the capitalist antithesis to Russian communism, and this would only get worse with time. This created the perfect soil for Ayn Rand to build a career. She had some steady work doing film in Hollywood, but her novels are what really cemented her legacy. Her work can be summed up in two words: overzealous anti-collectivism. Her first two novels were the mostly autobiographical We the Living, in which she quotes someone as saying Russia is a cemetery and we are slowly dying, and Anthem, which describes a dystopian collectivist future that has eliminated the word I. They saw some commercial success, but the thing that really launched her to fame was The Fountainhead in 1943. She and her husband then moved to California for a while, where Rand worked on the movie script for The Fountainhead while her husband raised peacocks. Huh. They moved to New York in 1951, and it's here that she began work on the novel that would define her and generations of teenage boys, Atlas Shrugged. She would often share manuscripts of the book and refine her ideas with a group of friends that moved to New York with her. This group came to call themselves The Collective, which is the funniest name they could have possibly chosen. I do want to talk about Atlas Shrugged at some point. Maybe. But I really want to talk about The Collective, because it's a good thing to keep in mind when trying to build a mental profile of Ayn Rand. And also because it's really, really, really funny. So, The Collective was made up of a handful of people, but the most important ones are Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden. Brandon only met Rand after sending her several articulate fan letters, and they flattered her enough to let him into her close friend circle. Just imagine for a second that, like, you, the viewer, wrote George R. R. Martin such flattering fan mail that he invited you to his house to play PlayStation. Like, they're totally fucking, right? As time went on, the group grew more ambitious, sending out objectivist newsletters and forming the Nathaniel Branden Institute, which was dedicated to spreading the good word about this one woman's philosophy. Rand would actually appoint Nathaniel as her intellectual heir and put her in the afterword of Atlas Shrugged, right next to her husband. All was going swimmingly until August of 1968, when the Institute dissolved entirely and Rand and Nathaniel parted ways permanently. Now, I know what you were thinking. And yes, you're entirely correct. They were fucking. Despite both of them being married, it turns out that objectivists don't really value marriage all that much, and with full knowledge of both of their spouses, they were commingling. Now, I'm not one to judge, consenting adults and all that, but what I don't understand is why that's suddenly different when Nathaniel catches the interest of a younger woman. According to Rand, they split because he betrayed his objectivist principles. But if you ask Nathaniel, it was because it was a lover's quarrel. Because of course it was. Rand would go on to change her intellectual heir to Leonard Peikoff, who would go on to found the Ayn Rand Institute and fuck up my research with his shit-ass website. I know this all seems like a bit of a side tangent, but I bring it up because the influences and actions of this group are still felt to this day, directly and indirectly. These are the people that helped Rand shape her most famous work and helped to refine her ideas, but they would also later go on to directly influence government. Like, yeah, a lot of politicians use her ideology as a guideline, but one of the members of the collective was Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was chairman of the Federal Reserve until 2006 and was direct contributor to the 2008 financial crisis. We're still living under the shadow of these people. Trump's favorite book is The Fountainhead. At this point in the video, we can skip past the history lesson and get into the actual meat of the ideology. If you want a better idea of how Ayn Rand's work directly influenced American government, then you can check out this Knowing Better video that is about this specific topic. Let's shift gears to the real big brain stuff, the real mind-expanding ideas. Let's talk about what objectivism is, what it does, and how it's changed in the modern era. So, what is objectivism? We'll begin with the Steelman version of her ideology. It won't be perfect, and there are a lot of people who have a lot of disagreements about what objectivism even is. We'll get to that. But from my research and from the books, This is how I interpret the strongest version of her ideology to be. Objectivism is a multifaceted system of morality and philosophy, which dictates how the world should ideally be run and how an individual should act within that world. The quickest way that I can summarize is by going over three very important terms to the ideology, those being objectivity, egoism, and altruism. Objectivity is exactly how it sounds. It says that the only world that exists and the only laws that exist are the ones of the world in which we tangibly live. There are no gods or religion of any kind, and that's why Rand is such a Reddit atheist. No shade, by the way. I love that for her. She's really cunty about it, and it's really entertaining to watch.
Okay, I just want to get this in before we break. You're an atheist.
Yes. I could do the same to you, you know.
Why?
Since you're the host, I won't say it, but in other circumstances, I would say I don't approve of religion. I recognize your right to it, but
Yeah, you don't approve of religion because?
because it's mystical, because it's based on faith, not on reason and facts.
She would also make a point that there are no inherent laws for people. There's no right to life or a bloodline claim to a throne. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Total horseshit. This is why in her work, Rand likes to point out the law of identity, which is one of the three fundamental laws of logic. It can be boiled down to A is A, or pointing out that the thing is in fact the thing. This D20 is this D20 and not some other object. It is a unique, singular thing. Look, I know it's simple, but Socrates had to start somewhere. Objectivism pulls a lot from these baseline logic principles, and Rand uses them in her work very explicitly when she's trying to make a point. See John Galt's in-universe 4-hour radio speech. Moving on, egoism is the idea that a man should only act in his own interests as dictated by his own logic. This is often conflated with selfishness, and that's not a conflation that Rand shies away from, as evident by this collection of her essays called The Virtue of Selfishness. The idea is that if everybody simply acted in their own rational self-interest, then everybody would be better off and happier. I know that sounds kind of socially untenable, and we'll get to that. Altruism is the opposite of egoism, according to Rand. Now, it's important to know that she doesn't use the word in the way that you and I do. Altruism to her means putting the needs and interests of others above your own, not merely helping people, but doing so at a detriment to yourself by a conscious choice. To Rand, this is the equivalent of committing suicide, and is an immoral and self-destructive way to live one's life.
But what's bad about the person who wants to help other people?
Well, to begin with, that's the big mistake. People can want to help other people properly and with very good reasons, but that isn't altruism. Altruism doesn't mean merely helping people. It means sacrificing yourself to others, placing the interests of others above your own. It's the self-sacrificing person who is an altruist.
Yeah, what's wrong with that?
What's wrong with committing suicide? What's wrong with giving up life? And why is the happiness of another person important and good, but not your own? Why are you always the outsider and the sacrificial animal?
For further clarification on what this means, Rand isn't talking about, like, helping a lady carry a crate of oranges up the stairs or something. She's not talking on the scale of everyday niceties. She's talking more about things like using tax dollars to build wheelchair ramps for schools. She says that it's an attempt to bring everyone down to the level of the handicapped.
Yeah, well, I don't understand why this is important. What are the consequences of the traditional notion that we've got here in the Western world that sacrifice is what love is all about?
Do you want the quickest examples that comes to my mind? The newest proposals of having special millions spent on subnormal children and on the handicapped, including those so-called kneeling buses. It's the attempt to bring everybody to the level of the handicapped.
Her words, not mine. There's also the dichotomy of individualism and collectivism that play a huge role in objectivist philosophy. Egoism is the way that this individualism manifests, and as such, Rand is one of the biggest defenders of capitalism in human history. This goes back to her stance on government in general, which she says should be stripped down bare to only the essentials of police, military, and law courts, enemies from within, enemies from without, and legal disputes. This would allow true capitalists to rise to the top of their full potential, unburdened by the grasping constraints of government and income taxes. This is contrasted by collectivism, which Rand considers the ultimate evil. A nation where the individual does not live for themselves, but rather for the needs of the state and for every other countryman, is no better than a slave. If you are not free to pursue your own goals and are instead compelled to act for the goals of the collective, then you are basically dead already. This worldview makes sense for somebody who worked hard to escape Stalinist Russia to make a better life for herself, and then being surrounded by anti-communist sentiment and the comparative wealth of the states likely cemented that idea. This is far from a comprehensive overview of the whole ideology, but it should be enough to give you the broad strokes. This all seems well and good on the surface, empowering even. The idea that you should be governed by your own will and mind rather than those of a god or government is really compelling. Unfortunately, this ideology doesn't scale well to the size of society or even like a household. You, the person watching this, might think that you have a rock solid logical foundation and a good heart. But the truth is that most people don't. People are emotional, illogical, and very susceptible to the influence of our peers. If a person that follows objectivism gets into their head that the best way to harvest apples is to cut down the entire tree, then it's going to be really hard to persuade them out of that idea because they came to it by way of their own rationality and logic. Objectivism is inherently averse to any outside influence or consideration, putting the utmost value into the self and seeing any collective action or influence as a very bad thing. This means that it is very, very difficult to persuade an objectivist, and no one is a better example of that than Ayn Rand herself. Rand is notoriously bullheaded, and any direct challenge to her ideology doesn't really go very well.
Yes, Miss Rand, I was one of those people who belonged to your cult where we were devouring your books, and I just wanted to say that as I matured, I am glad that I was able to differentiate with your philosophies.
Did you see our show last year? You want to create an incident?
No.
Pass it up.
She will gladly discuss her philosophy and provide clarifications, but any direct challenge usually ends with her calling her opponent clearly mentally deficient. I would show a clip here, but unfortunately Knowing Better seemed to snipe all the best clips, and I don't want to just steal from his video, so go watch his video. This kind of staunch rigidity is bad enough on an interpersonal level, but imagine that scaled to all of society. If everyone were to only act in their own selfish interest, then what's to stop people from just stealing or killing the guy in front of him to take a spot in line? To Rand's credit, she does specify that her laissez-faire ideas are mostly economic and that there should still in fact be, laws and police, but the logical extension of her ideology goes to that lawless extreme. Anyway, let's talk about libertarianism. I won't be providing a Steelman version of this ideology because I can't. These people are clowns, down to their very bones.
Should someone have to have a government-issued license to drive a car?
Hell no.
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
The license to drive? I'd like to see some competency exhibited by people before they drive.
Libertarianism is if you take the police, military, and law courts part of objectivism and say, what if those were also privatized? Surely the free market is the perfect vessel for law courts and the cops. The ideology is often confused with anarcho-capitalism, and yeah, they're the same thing. If you ask Google what the difference is, you'll get 100 different answers from 100 different libertarians. I know. I checked. In fact, the same goes for if you ask libertarians what libertarianism is. As Sam Cedar so succinctly puts it,
and to be honest with you, every libertarian I've ever had on has basically considered all the other libertarians I've had on to be not real libertarians.
Libertarianism as a label is only useful in that it distances the person from anarchy, and it also distances that person from Ayn Rand. Libertarianism as an ideology has a long and storied history, but modern libertarians got started around 1945. Now, if you, a savvy politician, wanted to use their ideas as a lever to push for deregulation or lower taxes, then it helps as a label to distance yourself from a bullheaded atheist woman. Rand was a divisive figure even back then, but if you call yourself a libertarian, then it sounds high-minded and educated. Liberty is even right there in the name. Not to mention that despite being very similar, Rand actually hated libertarians. She called them the hippies of the right and plagiarists, which is extremely fucking funny considering how much she yoinked from the ancient Greeks. This kind of distancing and image manipulation has been pretty effective for libertarianism as a brand, so to speak. Objectivism has been made a rather radioactive term by its creator and her terrible image. So even people who are amenable to her ideas still call themselves libertarians. Libertarianism still definitely has a brand image problem, though. Their ranks aren't exactly free from terrible people with terrible public images.
I mean, you're the one who sides with authoritarianism. You're the ones who side with government forcing workers and forcing employers to set the terms
Makes us free.
rather than people in voluntary transactions deciding what the terms of the deal should be.
I'm liking these voluntary 80 to 100-hour work weeks and the voluntary child labor at the time that was common.
Replace the king with the dictatorship of the proletarian. You're the one who would like to replace the king with enslaving those of us who happen to be more productive than others, with enslaving those of us who actually produce, so that we can feed parasites who do not want to work.
Oh, my bad. That's objectivist Urine Brook. Hold on, I must have got my clips mixed up. Let's take a look at libertarian Urine Brook. Wait a minute. Objectivism has been so effectively scrubbed from the public discourse that even people who still identify with the term, like Urine Brook, make no effort to discern themselves from libertarians. David Boaz, a distinguished senior fellow from the Cato Institute, wrote in 1997, "It seems to me that all objectivists are necessarily libertarians, though not all libertarians are objectivists." So, like, what the fuck are we even doing anymore? The terms have been so muddled and distorted that nobody can agree on anything anymore. This is why every libertarian is the only libertarian, and why the only unifying idea you can get out of these people is big government bad. The way this manifests in the modern day is that libertarianism as an ideology doesn't have grounded, educated thought leaders unifying people under its banner. Rather, it's a label used by grifters and people pushing the politics of personal grievance. I have done a lot of research on these people, and the only consistent thread that I can find is that they wanted to do something, but the government told them no. Maybe they wanted to pay their workers less than minimum wage, or maybe they didn't want to pay their income taxes, or maybe they wanted to set up some small business, but health and safety regulations got in the way. These people always have some personal story that pulled them to the libertarian label. It's not some underlying belief in the ideology. It's not some principled stance about the well-being of society. Hell, it's not even about a wider economic policy prescription. It's simply a way to give their personal grievance an air of legitimacy. Let's take a look at the most famous example of this in the modern day. Javier Milei is the current president of Argentina, and he has been since 2023. His big claim to fame is that he ran as an open libertarian. This was a huge moment for the legitimacy of the ideology. Finally, somebody carrying the libertarian flag all the way to world leader status. No more hiding behind larger labels like Republican or conservative. Finally, the world can see what a true blue libertarian can do. Milei spent the first year of his presidency absolutely decimating the economy of Argentina. Poverty rates reached 20-year highs of 57%, the national debt rose to 157% of the GDP, and the value of the Argentine peso compared to the US dollar jumped from 0.273% to 0.125%, cutting the value by over half. I think it's safe to say the entire country sank into the ocean. The worst thing for Milei's public image somehow wasn't the horrible plunge into economic despair, it was the obvious crypto rug pull he pulled on his own people. Hold on, let me put on my best folding ideas impression. In mid-February of 2025, Milei was involved in the creation of a crypto coin called Libra. The coin was made in conjunction with Kelsier Ventures, a company headed by Hayden Mark Davis, which specialized in crypto advising and pump and dump schemes. They've since gone completely silent and their whole website is down. 3 minutes after the creation of LibreCoin, Milei shared a number of social media posts promoting the coin, claiming that it would strengthen small businesses using crypto and bolster the economy of Argentina. These posts hyped the coin so much that it boosted the value from 0.000001 USD to $5.20 USD in the span of 40 minutes. What the post didn't say is that the founders of the coin, including Milei himself, presumably, but the exact amount I cannot say, held 70% of the coins that were on the market. And once the coin pumped to its peak, they dumped their stock and it dropped back down to 99 cents USD. This entire scheme took place over the course of a couple of hours, and it cost the people who bought in an estimated $87 million. I build this case against Milei not because I personally dislike him, but because he is a crystal clear example of the problems with modern-day libertarianism. Milei is an unapologetic grifter who is preying on a country with a rocky economic history to deregulate and make he and his cronies a lot of money. He was able to rise to power not by fronting ideas that have been shown to improve society, but by leveraging grievance politics to take advantage of the dispossessed. When I think of Milei, I think of this interview he had where he is red-faced and spitting about triggering libtards. He rails against the left and their virtue signaling, about how the right is morally superior to them, and if you give them an inch, they will kill you, all while calling his political detractors immoral, shit, and trash. This is the face of the global libertarian movement. This is the face of grievance politics. Red-faced, impotent rage, and the desire not to improve society, but to hurt those you consider less than you.
Al zurdo de mierda no le podés dar ni un milímetro.
Pero ¿me podés definir zurdo de mierda que no
Todos
lo
los que, digamos, los colectivistas, los que ponen, digamos, o sea, esa idea... A ver,
¿por qué le pones de mierda, digamos?
Porque son una mierda. O sea,
vos mezclás,
no,
pero
es que si pensás, pero si pensás distinto te van a aniquilar. Ese es el punto. Es decir, vos al zurdo no le podés dar un milímetro, porque le das un milímetro y lo toma para destrozarte. Es decir, digamos, o sea, vos no podés negociar con el zurdo. No se negocia. No se negocia con esa mierda, no se negocia porque te van a llevar puesto. Si tienen un gol.
Hey, do you remember when this was supposed to be a video about Bioshock? Coming back to Bioshock for this video, I had memories of this game being some high-minded battle of ideals. Could Rapture have worked if it just had the right people at the helm, or was it doomed to fail at the start? Is it human nature to let power corrupt them, or can you rise above the temptations and be a good person despite? Is Andrew Ryan a visionary, or simply a madman? After having read the books that they take notes from and replayed the game, I can answer that with a resounding... Bioshock does do one thing very well, and that's setting up ideas that the player can stew on later. It plants the kernels of ideas, and then wraps everything up before getting too preachy or beating you over the head with philosophy. As a result of that, Bioshock had, to my surprise, a shockingly light touch when it comes to the ideas it's directly criticizing. Instead of attacking Ayn Rand or her philosophy like I remembered, it instead lets characters serve as stand-ins for those ideas, and then asks you to judge those characters.
And it also, like, usually characters, each character generally is about a certain idea, and we don't just sort of come up with characters like we have an idea problem that we need to solve, and so let's introduce a character who's this guy, and he will be the guy who sort of shepherds you through that idea.
Let's start with the first big character the player really interacts with, Dr. Steinman. Steinman is shown as this insane surgeon, using the power of Adam to rewrite his patient's genes and make them beautiful. It's suggested that he might have gone insane from the power he was afforded, or maybe that Adam cooked his brain like it did with the rest of Rapture's inhabitants, but in reality, he was a terrible person right from the jump.
Ryan and Adam. Adam and Ryan. All those years of study, and was I ever truly a surgeon before I met them? How we plinked away with our scalpels and toy morality. Yes, we could lop a boil here and shave down a beak there, but could we really change anything? No. But Adam gives us the means to do it. And Ryan frees us from the phony ethics that held us back. change your look, change your sex, change your race. It's yours to change. Nobody else's.
Steinman is more interested in seeing out his ideals of beauty rather than fulfilling the desires of his patient. We can see this in the wake of destruction he leaves, the corpse and the ghosts he creates in his path.
You promised me pretty, Steinman. You promised me pretty. Now look at me. Look at me.
Or what about Sander Cohen? My husband. He's mine. You can't have it. Cohen is a man obsessed with perspective and performance, and as such, his persona is one of the high-minded auteur. He is an artist with pure vision and a perfect view of what makes art either worthwhile or simply droll garbage. His masterpiece is an exploration of beauty and death, sending the player, his little moth, on a journey to capture the images of notable corpses. Cohen is a shit artist. He has no interesting or new ideas. He has only grandeur and brutality to give his work flair. He lives on shock value while he spins flowery prose, but his work is as unrefined and blunt as an exploding piano.
Oh, Cohen, you sick fuck, let me out of there!
Cohen abuses the lack of governmental or societal oversight that Rapture affords him to be more explicit than other artists are legally allowed to be. But he doesn't use that lack of oversight to do anything truly interesting. In the words of creative director Ken Levine,
Cohen knows he's a hack, and he doesn't want to, he can't admit that to himself, so he has to wrap himself in all this nonsense, because the last thing he could ever do is look in the mirror and say, I'm not much of an artist.
This character-forward approach is greatly complemented by the environmental storytelling throughout the game. Ken talks about how much of the game's art direction is influenced by the Art Deco style of the late 20s and 30s. The 1920s, not these current 20s. The style does a very good job of pulling the player into that era, and it's also a style that has been heavily applied to Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead. It's very fitting considering that that's the era that Rand grew up in, but this has seemingly created a sort of retroactive association between the art style and her work, despite Atlas Shrugged being released in 1957. We see this in-game immediately with the lighthouse, the first thing we see, being very reminiscent of Art Deco architecture. Also the giant golden statue of Ryan in the front door. Taking the bathysphere down and sitting through Ryan's projector speech, you are constantly seeing images of power and opulence. Molded statues of ideal bodies, gold trim and neon everywhere you look. All good things of this earth flow into the city like all roads leading to Rome. Before you can even step out of the bathysphere, reality rears its ugly, ugly head to show you the real Rapture. Splicers are disfigured, bloody, and violent. Taking a close look at their models shows just how badly they've deteriorated, but they still wear collared shirts with a tie, masquerade masks, or even take the time to put up their hair. It's a juxtaposition that lingers through the entire game, so omnipresent that it fades into the background and begins to feel normal. There are points where this normalcy gets broken, and they serve as good reminders of what could have been. From the tennis batting cage in Steinman's office to the intact glassways that surround you with a view of the ocean, there is the promise and the harsh reality. I want to talk about a specific part of Atlas Shrugged, but to get there we have to do a little walking. The basic idea of the book is, what if all the heads of industry went on strike to protest the greedy workers and their coddling government? The everyday worker in Atlas Shrugged is a mindless idiot who cannot think for themselves. They're all easily bossed around, many of them can barely read, and they're all expecting handouts because they have this overinflated sense of entitlement. The government, however, is run by intelligent but comically evil men who literally plot global slavery in dark, smoky rooms. I really wish that was a joke, but I'm serious. It's in the chapter Miracle Metal. If you listen to the audiobook, it's about 33 minutes in. If you're reading the book, it's page 497. So presented with all this regulation from an evil government and the indignity of working with such lousy people, the CEOs go on strike. They leave their businesses and go somewhere where nobody can bother them so that they can build a new utopia. This utopia is called Galt's Gulch. And just to hammer home the similarities, the main character gets there by literally crashing her plane there.
She's also a pilot, don't worry about it.
When she wakes up, she is met by John Galt, an industrialist and the first to leave his factory, claiming he was going to stop the motor of the world. He served as inspiration for other men of the mind to leave their businesses as well and follow him to this new utopia to help him build it. Everyone there is an independent idealist, pays for services with gold because it has objective value, and worships a giant golden dollar sign in the center of town. Again, that's real, I promise. Galt's Gulch serves as the promise of Rand's ideology. Bioshock serves as the harsh reality. Atlas Shrugged as a book has this naked contempt for everyday people, portraying their heroes as ones who have to escape a broken and corrupt system so they can build a new one. Rapture shows us what happens to the everyday people that get trampled on the way. Rapture highlights the problems with the ideas presented in Atlas Shrugged, not by telling us, but by showing us the grimy, dirty reality of it. A society of hyper-individualism untethered by laws and petty morality is a society of sociopaths. Good people don't set up in Rapture, and because of that, Rapture self-selects for people with little or no morals. People who don't want the law getting in the way of their warped ideals. People who want to explore the extreme edges of what is right or wrong. People who feel no qualms for using others to get what they want. Let's talk about Frank Fontaine. Frank Fontaine has left his fingerprints on every part of Rapture, becoming so ingrained that he was able to tear the city apart. Frank started off his underwater crime spree as the head of a smuggling ring, which he ran out of Fontaine fisheries. He used this position to gain power, followers, and influence within Rapture until he was approached by Dr. Tenenbaum to fund a research project into Adam. Adam, being a miracle cure and genetic rewriting tool, was an obvious investment, so he backed the project with gusto. He founded Fontaine Futuristics to create plasmids, and when Tenenbaum told him that she needed little girls to mass-produce Adam, he created the Little Sisters Orphanage as a charitable organization to get them. Riding his charity angle to boost his public image, he created Fontaine's Home for the Poor, which he used as a front to collect undesirables for medical experimentation with Dr. Suchong. At first, Ryan actually saw Fontaine as a shining example of his ideals. He saw his rise to power as a self-sufficient man rising to his potential thanks to the lack of regulations or parasites holding him back, the exact purpose for which Rapture was built. He even defended Adam's negative side effects, like the whole brain cooking thing, telling complainers to come up with a better product.
Gregory, don't come whining to me about market forces, and don't expect me to punish citizens for showing a little initiative. If you don't like what Fontaine is doing, well, I suggest you find a way to offer a better product.
This was all before Ryan learned of the criminal side of Fontaine's business, and in particular his smuggling ring. See, Ryan wasn't worried about the whole turning little girls into monsters or experimenting on the poor thing. In fact, the only issue he has with the Little Sisters is that they were unpleasant to be around.
On my walk today, I had my first encounter with a pair of them. He, a lumbering palooka in a foul-smelling diving suit, and she, an unwashed moppet in a filthy pink smock. Her pallor was off, green and morbid. There was a rather unpleasant aspect to her demeanor, as if she were in an altogether different place than the rest of us. I understand the need for such creatures. I just wish they could make them more presentable.
No. He was worried that the smuggling ring would let Rapture's location slip to the surface instead of only allowing the information to spread through trusted channels. This led Ryan to try and shut down the smuggling ring, thus kicking off a rivalry between him and Fontaine. This eventually came to a head in a raid on the fisheries, putting Ryan's security forces against Fontaine's followers who were spliced up on Adam. Fontaine supposedly died in this confrontation, but in reality he got his face changed by Steinman and took on the alias of Atlas. You, the player, were ultimately Fontaine's backup plan. Ryan had control of the splicers through pheromone manipulation, Fontaine couldn't leverage his influence or connections after faking his death, and he had to work in the shadows to avoid Ryan. So instead, he sent in his brainwashed sleeper agent. Being the idealist he was, Ryan tried to break you free from his influence, but he wasn't powerful enough to beat literal mind control.
A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Kill!
Fontaine was a bastard through and through. He took any and all opportunity to enrich himself in his blind pursuit of power, and as such was a perfect fit for Rapture. He is the perfect criticism of Ayn Rand's ideology, because he is a warning of what that ideology would bring. Let a man with no scruples run free, and he will perform unspeakable acts until he is stopped. The only one able to stop him was the only other big fish in town. And even then, it's only because he stepped on his toes. There are reasons that laws interact with economics, and those reasons are reflected in everything Fontaine has touched. The answer to dangerous drugs being circulated isn't to offer a better product. The answer is government regulation. Ryan, in his own strange way, is a much more sympathetic character. Terrible person, yes, but at the very least, he is a man with principles that he doggedly follows to achieve his vision. He seems to directly follow objectivist ideology, providing protection from outside agitators in the form of secrecy, protection from internal agitators with his security forces, and though we don't see a court in the game, he does kill people, which is kind of like a trial. Ryan takes after John Galt in a lot of ways, luring visionaries to his little utopia and escaping the parasites outside of it. He even has his office in the industrial area of the city because that's where he would be the most comfortable.
You encounter Ryan in his sort of like that he would live in an area of industry.
Okay.
You know, so he lives in this very industrial area because that's where he would feel most comfortable. And that we wanted his office, his lair, to sort of be not in some, residential zone, but where he wants to wake up and smell the grease fires and the machines and the smoke. That's in his lifeblood. Industry is his lifeblood.
Ryan isn't some cynical opportunist looking to gain power. In fact, he seems to be the only true believer in the entire story outside of Tenenbaum. I think that this is the most clear in his "a man chooses, a slave obeys" speech. That phrase, to me, reads as an allegory to the books, specifically The Fountainhead and its dynamic between creators and second-handers. The Fountainhead is a book that's very character-focused, trying to build on what Ayn Rand would consider an ideal arbiter of her beliefs. In the book, she labors, through her character's dialogue, that there are two types of men in the world. Creators are those with drive, vision, passion, and the determination to see those things through. They create the things that move the world forward and bring humanity into the future. Second-handers are most everyone else. Those that simply coast off the achievements of creators and exist only to leech. They believe that altruism is the highest virtue among men, and that selfishness is the ultimate evil. Ryan, in his speech, seems to reframe the dynamic in a subtle way. Where the Fountainhead paints second-handers as immoral parasites, Ryan sees them as slaves. Slaves in some cases to literal mind control, but in a more metaphorical sense, they're slaves to their own inadequacy. They're slaves to a system that holds them down through regulation. They're slaves to their own lack of ambition. They're slaves to the moral teachings of society or religion. Slaves aren't immoral agents holding back humanity. Rather, a slave is someone to be set free. And that's what Rapture was built to do. Rapture was supposed to provide a free environment for a man to choose for himself, rather than mindlessly obey like a slave. He's wrong, of course. His ideal society turns out terrible for very obvious reasons. But what's important to me is that he truly believes he's doing the right thing. In this way, he's actually a fairly accurate representation of his namesake. Ayn Rand, despite her many faults, was a true believer of her ideals. She would advocate for terrible ideas, but that's because she believed that despite whatever hardship they may bring, society would come out the other side stronger and freer. Her ideas were rooted in absolute, unwavering freedom for the most number of people possible, and that honest, earnest belief is why I can't bring myself to completely hate her. In the foreword for The Fountainhead, there's a section that talks about Rand's journal and her feelings while she was writing the book, and there's a quote from it that reads, "I felt such indignation at the state of things as they are, that I felt I could not move one step closer towards things as they ought to be." I relate to that so deeply, and it's such a small but surprising shared glimmer of humanity that I didn't expect going into her work. Even though we have wildly different foundations that we pull from and wildly different ideas, Rand and I felt a similar thing all these years apart. Ultimately, the thing Bioshock does best is bring us into this failing world and make it believable. We can read about ideology all day, see the movie adaptations, watch YouTube videos, but actually being in that world and interacting with it on a personal level is a whole different experience. I think what makes Bioshock such an effective critique of Rand's work is that it pulls people out of the high-minded bullshit of it all. Instead of these abstract ideas that make you feel like you're swallowing a textbook, they're pulled down and cemented into physical characters to be given form. Once you have that object, that person that represents an idea or an extreme, it becomes much, much easier to grasp and think about. We can sympathize with Ryan, the character, because there is an inherent humanity in thinking about a person rather than a philosophical concept. That humanity is exactly what makes a character like Frank Fontaine so horrible. Or rather, the fact that he was so willing to throw it away. Fontaine was never interested in the idea of a better future or even a better rapture. He was interested in a thicker wallet. Fontaine thought those ideas were childish, naive, even weak. To Fontaine, the world is shit, and the only people who can rise above that shit are the ones willing to step on the weak and backstab the strong. Playing fair is a fool's errand and only turns you into a big sucker. However, the most interesting thing about people like Fontaine is how they justify this to themselves. They think everybody else does it too. Everybody wants something. Everybody is willing to do horrible things when backed into a corner. He just thinks he's being honest about it. To Frank, throwing away his humanity was an easy choice. He may have even forgot he had it in the first place. And when his back is against the wall, he's willing to go even further and throw away anything as long as he comes out on top. Before the player breaks free of his mind control, Fontaine had never taken Adam. He never used a single plasmid because he saw firsthand the damage it did to those who worked underneath him. Now that he's completely out of options, he gets desperate and finds any remaining levers of power he can pull. Even riding the elevator to his admittedly shit boss fight, he's trying to emotionally manipulate you.
I remember when me and the crowd put you in that sub. You were no more than 2. You were my ace in the hole, but you were also the closest thing I ever had to a son. And that's why this hurts. Betrayal, kid. Life ain't strictly business.
It's that constant narcissism that's defined his entire life coming through yet again. How could you do this to me? Why are you betraying me? Even when trying to tug at your heartstrings in yet another act, he just can't help himself. It's fitting that in the end, he was brought down by a collection of the weak working together, the helpless little sisters who represent the game's most obvious moral choice. We have a habit in the modern day of thinking that we're surrounded by Andrew Ryans, people who are just woefully misinformed, and if they were just shown the right ideas or taught the right bit of information, that they could be pulled over to the side of rationality. The reality is that we are being surrounded more and more by Frank Fontaines. These people don't operate on morals or ideology to guide their actions, rather they operate on narcissism, cynicism, and grievance. For these people, there is no such thing as a better future. Things are shit, will continue to be shit, and to think otherwise is naive. All you can do is try to get your bag on the way out, regardless of the people you hurt or the earth you scorch. In short, these people are grifters. I think that were Rand alive today, she would hate these people. She would hate the way they carry themselves, she would hate the way they govern, and she would especially hate the way that they bastardize her ideals. These people aren't objectivists. They aren't libertarians. They aren't high-minded industrialists or philosophical thinkers. These people are opportunists. The Fountainhead is Trump's favorite book, and I'm sure that makes Ayn Rand spin in her fucking grave. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. This video was a very long time coming. I had stewed on the script for quite a while, and it went through multiple iterations, and I had to take all the fucking time to read the books, and I took notes on the books, and a lot of those notes got scrapped, and it's like, this video just took too long. Moving forward with the channel, I want to try and expand more outside of just video game content. I have like politics I want to talk about. I have other like real life things I want to talk about. I want to talk about like different music and subcultures, and I want to try and not pigeonhole myself into just being a video game channel. I want to be I want to have broader interests in that. So moving forward, expect more of that. I know I've been going for quite a while. I don't have a good excuse for it. A lot of it was frankly just laziness. But this year I am shooting for a goal of 3 videos, which is I'm giving myself 4-month turnover time. And if I get done sooner, then that just means the next video can take longer. This is video number 1 of this year. I have 2 others planned. And if I can, fucking figure out how to get the scripts to work the way that I want them to, then it should be smooth sailing. But as before, I cannot promise anything because things change. But that's all from me. Follow me on Bluesky. I actually do post on there, and I've been streaming on Twitch every Sunday. I plan to keep doing that moving forward. And maybe give me a subscribe. Just give this guy a subscribe, and I will see you all next time. I love you. Bye-bye.